Ladies and gentlemen, please join Kent Emerson.
There were some problems with the mic there. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen from One King West in downtown Toronto. Welcome to the Empire Club of Canada. For those of you just joining us either through our webcast or podcast, welcome to the meeting. Today we present Tony Irwin, President, Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario. Today's topic is No Vacancy, Tackling Ontario's Rental Housing Supply Crisis. This is a very hot topic in Toronto right now and is one that various levels of governments have recognized. In the last 4 years in particular have doubled down on initiatives trying to improve housing. When you think about this topic, everyone agrees with the problem, that there is not enough rental housing to go around in the GTA. This is something that other jurisdictions have been dealing with a lot longer than we have. Years ago in the 90s when I arrived in Manhattan, I was successful in finding an apartment because I was willing to tip management 1 month's rent and travel to Queens to procure a special bottle of vodka to give to the super. And then at that point in time, he was willing to vouch for my character. Those activities were once unheard of in Toronto, but now I've been hearing more and more stories like that. And that's because Toronto's vacancy rate is low, around 0.5%, and this has forced rental housing prices to skyrocket. The influx in new population in the GTA will continue. In a 2017 study by the Ontario Ministry of Finance, they're predicting 2.8 million people by 2041 will enter the GTA alone. And this will really continue to put pressure on the housing equation. In recent years, governments have taken action, such as the Ontario government in 2017. Perhaps the most notable initiative that they did was a non-resident speculation tax. However, there was also a number of changes on the supply side around surplus land and allowances for the city of Toronto to use vacant homes, to tax vacant homes. In October, Mayor Tory announced his 3-point housing plan, which includes speeding up of approvals, creating new units through the current city land, and working with provincial and federal governments on government lands. And in January, City Council voted 21-4 in favor of the creation of 10,000 new units. We all know that the Ontario government has recently made a number of changes to the Landlord-Tenant Board and around rent control. And recently, Minister Steve Clark wrapped up his consultation on the government's Housing Supply Action Plan that was undertaken to inform the new government's plan on how they will be addressing housing going forward. So Tony, I think there's a lot of things going on, and in part I think you're here to talk about them and to tell us what you think is working and what you don't think is working and give us your prediction. So let's get started. Today's speaker has a tremendous vantage point to talk to us from the helm of FRPO. The Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario is the largest association in Ontario representing those who own, manage, build, and finance, service, and supply residential homes. Before joining FRPO, he was president and CEO of the Canadian Consumer Financial Association, a national trade association representing businesses that provide a range of financial products to Canadians. Previously, he was vice president of North American Government Affairs with Dollar Financial Group Incorporated, where he served as chairman of the Canadian Payday Loan Association and was active with the Community Financial Services Association of America. He also is experienced in the insurance industry, where he implemented a national government relations strategy and served as an official company spokesman for Allstate. Tony has also served as executive director of the Justin Eves Foundation, a nonprofit organization granting scholarships and bursaries to learning disabled and disadvantaged young people to assist them in achieving a post-secondary education. In government, he has also held key political roles, senior advisor to Ontario Premier, and executive assistant to the Leader of the Opposition. Please welcome the President and CEO of FRPO, Tony Irwin.
Thank you, Kent, for the warm introduction. Kent and I go back a number of years from, I guess, a few lifetimes ago, but this world is small, and so I am honored, and it's an honor and privilege to be invited to this prestigious podium. I think I was in the room at the back, but I saw up on the screens some of the previous speakers who have stood at this podium, and really it is many remarkable leaders, over 3,500 prominent Canadian and international leaders since 1903, and I am very grateful to be among that group of such distinguished individuals. I also would like to thank a few of our board members who are here today, Board Chair Margaret Hurd, Kent Kirsch, Rob Pike, Tyler Seaman. I want to thank you, and also want to extend my appreciation to Yardi Canada and to Minto for making this event possible. Thank you so much. So as Kent alluded, he of course explained the role that I now fill with FRPO and talked a little bit about what FRPO is. For over 30 years, we've represented the rental housing sector in Ontario, and we are the largest association in the province, representing those who own, manage, build, finance, service, and supply residential rental homes. FRPO represents more than 2,200 members who own or manage over 350,000 units across Ontario. I'm pleased to have this forum today to talk about something vitally important to the city and to this province: access to adequate rental housing. Before I start, though, I'd like to share a story. One of our members was proposing a new rental building in Dundas, Ontario, a community with historically one of the tightest rental markets in southern Ontario. It was an infill proposal next to an existing 7-story rental building they owned, but it required 9 stories with 64 suites for the project economics to be viable. To give you some sense of the neighborhood, there were already 4 9-story condos and a 13-story building within 400 meters of the site. So what was being proposed was not atypical to the neighborhood. The proposal required a zoning bylaw amendment, so our member went through a 3-year process before finally securing all of the necessary approvals from city staff, planning committee, city council, etc. So you might think that's the end of the story, but you'd be wrong, because the decision was appealed to the external planning appeals body by a resident who simply paid a $175 fee. What happened next? Well, it took our member 7 months to get a pre-hearing, 6 more months to get a first 5-day block with a member of the appeal board, 5 more months to get a second 5-day block with the member, then 14 more months before the appeal was dismissed. So to recap, a project that was seeking density that was consistent with the immediate neighborhood took almost 6 years to be approved. But by that time, rental costs, or construction costs, had increased significantly to the point where the developer is now reviewing to see whether the project is even feasible to proceed, and likely it won't be. This story illustrates some of the challenges our industry faces as we try to add more supply to the market. So today I'm going to share some practical policy solutions we think government can consider implementing to help address the rental housing supply crisis we currently face in Ontario today. As rental housing providers, we believe we have an obligation to be the best corporate citizens we can be, providing the best product and helping tenants who need it. Our members are aware and sensitive to real struggles of affordability facing many Ontarians on a daily basis. We are supportive of measures that help tenants address housing costs, such as shelter allowances, portable housing benefits, and income support programs. We want people to stay in our buildings so our members can benefit from long-lasting and positive relationships with their tenants. We've had tenants who've lost their jobs and weren't able to cover their rent, so the property manager hired them as building superintendents and forgave unpaid rents. We have many examples of rental housing providers proactively making accessibility investments to improve the daily lives of their tenants. We have examples of property managers waiving rent increases to individuals on fixed incomes who truly cannot afford the increase. There are examples of rental housing providers doing things every day to help the broader community in collaboration with tenants. In Thorncliffe Park, for example, the property owner is using half an acre as a community garden while working with tenants and a community group. The crop is harvested and given to a local school for a lunch program. Now, as the subject of my speech conveys, there is a crisis when it comes to housing in Ontario, especially adequate supply of rental housing. The primary indicator to assess the health of a rental housing market is its vacancy rate. And I think, as was alluded to at the outset, vacancy rates have been trending downward the past few years in Ontario. CMHC figures for 2018 showed Ontario was at a 16-year low of 1.8%. The problem is even worse in the city of Toronto, where the vacancy rate was 1.1%. To provide you some context, last year Alberta's vacancy rate was at 5.5%, Saskatchewan 8.7%, Newfoundland and Labrador 6%. Most experts believe a healthy rental market should have a 3 to 4% vacancy rate. So why is this happening in Ontario? A recent Urbanation report concluded Ontario's rental housing demand is at a 45-year high. Rental housing demand is driven by strong job growth, with more and more people choosing to live in Ontario, and specifically in the GTA, and the increasing cost of home ownership. Quite simply, new units are not coming onto the market fast enough to meet the increasing demand for rental housing. In fact, it is getting worse. The number of new purpose-built rental units in Ontario decreased in 2018 over 2017, going from 8,500 to 6,800. The Urbanation report concluded that unless significant policy action is taken to spur construction, Ontario will have a 7,000 to 10,000 unit annual deficit by 2029. That means Ontario must build 70 to 100,000 new units in the next 10 years to fill the supply gap. This is a serious challenge. And that is why we are pleased to see the province committing to taking strong action to address the housing supply crisis, and doing so in a consultative manner. Rental housing providers and other stakeholders, some of whom are in this room today, have been part of many in-person consultation sessions to assist the government in developing its housing supply action plan. We are pleased to see the province open to looking at new solutions. Now, to get a balanced market, policymakers must take an outcome-based approach. The intended outcome is straightforward: stimulate development of 70 to 100,000 rental housing units over the next 10 years to fill the supply gap. But there is no one magic bullet. Various policies must be designed to bring more rental housing development in places where it makes sense and at a quicker pace. The Ford government took the first step last year by creating an exemption for new units from the rent increase guideline. This exemption will undoubtedly improve the feasibility of new rental housing projects and spur more development to occur at a time when it's most needed. It's a great start, and we commend the government for taking strong policy action to improve supply, the precursor to addressing affordability and choice for tenants. But more needs to be done. One of the biggest challenges to getting more rental housing built in Ontario is the red tape that causes huge delays in getting rental units to market. As my story alluded at the beginning, approvals are often delayed due to NIMBYism and some neighborhood politicians acting in their own electoral self-interest to fight projects, contrary to provincial policy interests. To get out of the rental housing crisis we are in, we need land use policies that encourage developments in places where it makes sense. Many here are familiar with land use planning in our province. Ontario has, for example, a Places to Grow Act for areas where it wants development to occur. We also have a Places to Not Grow Act. By that I mean protected areas such as the Greenbelt. What we need right now is a provincial policy-led spark to spur construction of rental housing in places where it makes sense. A new legislative framework that drives that outcome. We can call it the Places to Fast Track Rental Housing Act. The concept is relatively simple. Through provincial authority, provide pre-permitting and as-of-right zoning for rental housing developments in areas where it makes sense and rental housing is needed. This does not mean forced intensification in established single-family neighborhoods. That is not the answer. The proposed provincial zoning for rental housing could be targeted in the following types of areas: along higher-order transit routes and around transit stations, declining retail locations like strip plazas, commercial avenues with strip commercial, such as Dundas Street in Mississauga, and underutilized industrial lands where manufacturing will not come back. You would only do this in select communities where the additional supply can be consumed by market demand. The policy framework should be time-limited to create urgency to builders and get rental housing development going now, as opposed to slowly planning for a pipeline of projects. We could pilot this concept for 5 years and then reassess based on success. So what does cutting approval time in a pre-permitted as-of-right zoning framework do for project economics? We recently commissioned the Altus Group to look at this very issue. The conclusion was that cutting approval time from a typical 4 years to something closer to 6 months would result in an 11% savings on the cost of building rental projects. This would undoubtedly move many projects from being not feasible to projects that are economical for the developer to proceed with. Creating this framework of time-limited, as-of-right zoning in targeted areas for purpose-built rental to incent development is one tool in the toolbox, but we need more. When looking at the typical cost structure of rental housing developments after hard construction costs, the next two biggest cost drivers are cost of land and development fees and charges. We appreciate that all governments face fiscal challenges. However, government fees and charges do represent a significant barrier to development. 18% of the cost of a typical rental housing project in the City of Toronto can be attributed to HST, development charges, and other government-imposed fees and charges. The cost of land is another issue we need to find creative ways to address. It represents over a quarter of the cost of projects, or 26% to be exact. We all understand the problem. Land in Toronto and the GTA is becoming more and more expensive. Projects underway today are based on land prices from 2 or 3 years ago. Land in Toronto may have been valued at $75 a buildable square foot then, so a particular development may have been feasible at that price point. Today, land prices have tripled or quadrupled, meaning many projects you see in the queue would not proceed if the decision was being made today. The cost of land is making it increasingly more difficult to find opportunities for rental housing developments with the right business case to proceed. So how do we solve this? No one will give you free land to build rental housing, but we can ensure we get maximum value on existing rental housing complexes. You may have driven around rental housing properties with a few buildings, and you may have also noticed that some have space for maybe a third or even a fourth tower. We call them unicorn sites. These sites are abundant in the province. They represent untapped potential to put more units on the market without any cost to buy new land. What can government do to realize this potential? Ontario could develop a framework mandating approval of additional towers on these sites, conditional on a set of reasonable parameters to avoid NIMBYism from stopping these developments. Or it could create an application-based concierge program, approving development on these sites using provincial authority. These are surely reasonable solutions that could be utilized to provide much-needed supply when it's most needed. Creating a framework for time-limited as-of-right zoning and unlocking the potential of unicorn sites are two measures government can take to spur more supply. But we must do more. There are many municipal policies that add cost to developments but do not provide direct revenue to municipalities. We can call them embedded costs. These policies may make sense in a vacuum, but must be reviewed in the current supply crisis as they inhibit development of more rental units. They often work to reduce density in certain locations. For example, Section 37 of the Planning Act allows the city to ask for benefits when a development requires a zoning bylaw amendment. The tool is intended to provide greater density in exchange for community benefit, but often zoning is artificially low and out of date. So Section 37 winds up being used as a bargaining tool to get density that should have been allowed to begin with. Another example is inclusionary zoning. Suppose a developer wants 35 floors. The city ends up only permitting 19 and says 2 of the floors have to be affordable housing, so you're left with only 17 floors of market rent. Having to reduce the number of units by half, as in this example, would kill most rental housing projects. And this reflects the lived experience of some of our members in the Midtown Plan area. So you can imagine how many potential rental housing projects are being left undeveloped. There are other examples of policy decisions by municipalities that move the needle on the business case away from development. These include unreasonable parkland requirements and parking ratios. We're not against either of these policies in terms of, we are not against the intent, of either of these policies. But these policies are often outdated and need to reflect today's environment. For example, parking ratios for buildings near transit stations should be reviewed. Many millennials do not own cars. The days of 2-car families, especially in apartment buildings in urban areas, are long gone. So parking ratios should be modernized in a manner that makes sense, reflecting the needs of today's renters. These types of municipal bylaws impact the number of rental housing units coming onto the market. So far, we've talked about 3 things government can do to get more rental supply on the market. But that still won't be sufficient to get 70 to 100,000 new units we need in the coming decade. The government also needs to look at the overall operating climate that informs investment decisions in rental housing projects. Operating rental housing is becoming increasingly challenging. The current stock of rental units in Ontario is relatively old. Over 80% of units were built before 1980, and only 7% have been built since the year 2000. In Toronto, less than 4% have been built since the year 2000. Historically, vacancy decontrol has been the ingredient that makes the rent control regime workable in these older buildings. So essentially, when a tenant leaves, rent can be reset to market level. That's how rental housing providers ensured a revenue stream to address the cost of repairs and maintenance of these older buildings. However, as the supply gap is increasing, fewer and fewer people are leaving their units. Turnover has gone down dramatically, with some who used to report turnover rates at 25 to 30%, now reporting rates at closer to 10%. This, coupled with rising pressure from organized groups fighting legal above-guideline rent increases, has made the climate for operating rental housing very challenging. And that climate informs investment decisions. A reasonable solution to address this changing dynamic would be to move to a CPI plus 2% model for annual rent increase guideline. This measure would alleviate some of the emerging pressures on feasibility of operating rental housing projects. There are a few other measures the government can take to address the general climate that impacts rental housing decisions. Reform and adequately resource the Landlord and Tenant Board. Provide more certainty for landlords and tenants in the above-guideline increase application process, and prohibit the cultivation of cannabis in rental housing units. There is no one magic bullet to address the supply crisis in rental housing in the province of Ontario. The government must tackle the problem from an outcome-based approach. We need 70 to 100,000 new rental units to balance the market over the next decade. We are proposing concrete policy measures that will help address the supply gap. A time-limited, as-of-right zoning framework to pre-permit rental housing in areas where it makes sense, away from single-family neighborhoods, along transit corridors and stations, and other more receptive places. A provincial application-based concierge service to unlock the full potential of unicorn sites, where you can add buildings to existing rental complexes to address the increasing cost of land. Reviewing municipal policies that reduce the number of rental units that come to market, resulting in embedded costs such as misuse of Section 37, inclusionary zoning, and inappropriate parking ratios, especially near transit nodes. And modernizing policies around rent control in an environment where turnovers are decreasing and opposition to above-guideline increases is increasing. These are some proposals among a suite of measures we are asking the government to consider in order to tackle our rental housing supply crisis. Rental housing is a critical segment of Ontario's housing supply and will continue to become more important as our population grows and the cost of owning a home continues to rise. Let's do what's right, and let's get more rental housing built in Ontario, starting now. FRPO and our members look forward to working with all levels of government to get this done. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. That was great. We have a couple of people standing by with microphones for the Q&A, and if I could ask anyone who was going to ask a question to introduce themselves and introduce the organization they're from. Questions? I'll start it off while people are thinking. You had a number of policies, prescriptions you've done today, Tony, of different complexity. If you had to pick the one, either the lowest hanging fruit or the one that is if you had to pick one on a desert island, which one would it be? And
I'm just thinking about being on a desert island. So I think that I would probably say they are obviously all important, but if I had to choose one, I think really unlocking these unicorn sites I talked about, so sites where there are a few towers, there's room to build additional towers. In speaking with our members, what they have to go through and the story I told at the beginning, there's got to be a better way. That the land is there, it's not being fully utilized. We need more units. Let's pave the way to be able to make those sites into ones that can be further developed, and where we can get more towers, more units for people who need places to rent. That would be my answer.
Hi, Tony. My name is Andrew McCallum. I'm here as president of the Waterloo Regional Apartment Management Association. Outside of Toronto, municipalities are acting in isolated ways, making decisions that are having similar and adding similar challenges to development and rental housing along the way. I guess my question is, if we're to look at some of the issues that are confronting smaller municipalities outside the big city, what might be some solutions from your point of view?
Thank you for the question, Andrew. I would think that certainly in smaller communities where we come from, allowing secondary suites, right now, certainly that is something I think that a lot of governments recognize. Laneway suites, secondary suites is also something that should be considered and should be sort of, the barriers should be eased to be able to make those sorts of accommodations more possible. Development charges should be probably waived on those sorts of, they were already paid when the original house was built, and then have to pay development charges the second time to build a secondary suite. It doesn't seem to be, the most sort of hospitable for those who want to create more units. So all those sorts of measures, I would think that in communities like Waterloo, secondary suites are very important. We need to look at all options for people, places where people can live. And if that can be done, then I think municipal governments need to, and are starting to, but need to do more to make that feasible.
Rachel Calabay, member of the Ontario Architects Association and member of their Housing Affordability Task Group. And thank you. I was talking with your predecessor with this organization, and you put out great reports. So the Ontario Places to Grow plan, when it was originally put out, the growth plan, gave municipalities, 3 years to upgrade their densities and planning to match. What would be the effect, and still hasn't happened, what would be the effect if, for instance, Toronto's land use and densities matched the Ontario targets?
Well, I think density is, and I'm mindful of Deputy Mayor from Toronto in the audience here, and knows far more about specifics to the City of Toronto density than I would claim to. But I think the point is that certainly from our point of view, density is something that has to be addressed head on. I mean, we can't, we recognize, people recognize that more housing is needed, but then when mid-rise building wants to be built, people are all saying that that's not okay, and they're protesting against it. So certainly bringing plans into harmony makes sense, but I think more importantly, density is a reality of our future. We have to embrace the fact that more density is needed. There are thoughtful ways to go about it. I'm not suggesting we do it in residential neighborhoods, but I think we do need to acknowledge the fact that if we're going to house the increasing number of people that choose to live in Ontario every year, we need density to be able to do that. So going back and updating plans, provincial plan, which is happening now, or we've certainly been involved in consultations with the Ontario government on that, and municipalities to say we need to look at plans that are outdated and see about making them, bringing them into line with what makes more sense going forward into the future, so we can actually have density that makes sense in places where it makes sense to be able to provide more housing for people. I think that's the goal that we need to be striving for.
Also to have more as-of-right zoning and approvals to reduce the risk and the timeline, the approvals
Absolutely.
timeline. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. It's Ron Tam, private property managers in North Toronto, Viron Properties. You mentioned that 80% of the rental stock is from before 1980. I just wanted to know if one of the costs I think that we've contemplated in looking at redevelopment opportunities is replacement cost. When you have, say, an existing low-rise building and where there's an opportunity to redevelop that into something with higher density, one of the stumbling blocks is also just replacing the replacement cost and dealing with, incentivizing existing tenants to relocate while redevelopment is ongoing. So I'm just wondering if there was any discussion on how to approach that, if there's that as a policy has been looked at, if there's a streamlined way for that to occur in a way that achieves the policy of increasing density, but of course also making it, recognizing that existing tenants might have a challenge in that situation.
Well, it's certainly topical for those reading the Toronto Star over the last couple of days. And so, I think this is a topic. I guess what I would say first and foremost is certainly, and I know in speaking with our own members, making sure that tenants are, they come first. They're the customer. They're the person that lives in the building. And so, yes, understanding that we need to be able to modernize buildings, improve buildings. Perhaps sometimes it means you need to undergo major renovation. Working with the tenants to make sure that they understand what you're wanting to do, and that they are given, they are treated fairly and respectfully. I think this is something that just at a human level is very important in all we do, and I think our members certainly support that. So where do you find the balance between wanting to improve your buildings, bring them up to a better sort of state, but also ensuring that the tenants are respected, and whether that be providing them with supports during that period of time, providing them with a reasonable sort of sum of money to be able to maybe go somewhere else, chance to come back when the work is done. There's all kinds of different ways that it can be addressed, but I think we need to make sure that people are treated fairly and with dignity, but also at the same time improving our buildings, and it's always a balancing act.
One here. Hi, Brian Levy from Preston Group. Just want to talk about development charges. They've gone up, I guess the 3 years plan to go up 100% in 3 years. The first increase was November 1st, 2018 at 50%. Then this coming November 1st, another 30%. And then November 1st, 2020, another 20%. So given that we're coming up to the second increase this November 1st, is there anything that we're doing to, change that from what it was decided? Or, clearly it's a huge stumbling block. You talked about the timing to getting these approvals. A lot of these projects that were brought forth a couple years ago are now looking at, in some cases, doubling development charges and going up $5-10 million on a given project simply just kills the project. So is there anything that's immediate that's coming to change that coming increase November 1st or next year's increase?
So the answer to is there anything coming immediate, I'm probably the wrong guy to ask about what immediately is coming, since I'm not the one that will be making any of those decisions. But my colleague Daryl Chong from the Greater Toronto Apartment Association is here today, and I know he spends a lot of time at City Hall. I think he has certainly a frequent flyer pass to get him in and out of there for all the time he spends speaking with councillors and staff at City Hall. At the provincial level, Deputy Minister LeBlanc has probably seen us more than she ever imagined that she would in the last 3 months or so. So we have spent a lot of time talking with the government on a variety of issues. Development charges certainly are part of that mix, part of the conversation. I will focus on that since that's more my what I've been spending my most recent time on. But nevertheless, understanding the development charges, as I talked about in my remarks, are a major component of building costs. For those who want to build rental apartments, that's a huge challenge. Yes, we understand that development charges are necessary. Growth is supposed to pay for growth, after all. But it's complicated, and so economics do need to work. Obviously, do need to be feasible for a project to proceed. And we're working with government, certainly at the provincial level, and I know at the city too, to say how can we? Are there different options? Are there better ways we can go about this? We've talked about GTA, talked about perhaps a separate category for purpose-built rental housing. Is that a solution? We are all about coming up with many different solutions as we possibly can, with the end goal of trying to get more rental housing built. That is the goal. I think that's the goal everyone wants. All forms of housing are needed, but for the purposes of what I do, rental housing. And so I think we have governments who are interested in working with us on it. That's not an immediate answer for you for what's happening, tomorrow or next month. But we have positive conversations occurring with government, and we're hopeful that good things will come.
Tony, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
I'm pleased to welcome Heather Brady, National Sales Manager for Yardi Canada, today's lead sponsor, to come to the podium and thank the speaker.
Good afternoon. I'm Heather Brady. I'm the National Director of Sales of Yardi Canada. And for those of you in the room who do not know Yardi, although I suspect that's very few, We are a developer, designer, and supporter of software that's focused solely on the real estate industry. We've been doing that for over 30 years, 20 in Canada, and we're very happy to be supporters of events like today. It's great to be in this setting, in the Empire Club, which hosts so many prestigious speakers, but also gives platform to great ideas and a great venue to be able to share and discuss those ideas. We've also been heavy supporters of FRPO over the years for exactly the reasons that you may have seen today. It's an organization that embraces and looks to the future, looks at the challenging issues of the future, and really comes up with solid evidence-based ideas about how to change that. So we're happy to be part of that. I hope the discussion today gives all of us something to think about how we can be part of the solution. And thank you, Tony. It was very good discussion. And have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. We have a few events coming up. On Thursday, we have the Honourable David Lametti, Canada's Attorney General and Minister of Justice. Had a very interesting time about that portfolio, so please come on Thursday if you can. And then we have an International Women's Day panel on March 5th, featuring the Honourable Mary Ying. I see some heads nodding over there. So yeah, thanks for. I think you guys are coming to that. Thank you for buying a table. And we are going to have the Honourable Vic Fideli. It's not quite on the website, but it will be up in the next few days on March 28th. So thank you very much for coming today, and the meeting is adjourned.